last week's session was actually an introduction to psychotherapy in general and our concept of psychotherapy, and really began by the discussion of the fact that psychotherapy as a form had its roots in the late 19th, had its roots in the 19th century, early 20th century, and was a peculiar form to the period that depended upon an empirical, systematic approach to patients, if you will, scientific approach to them. And obviously, Freud was a crucial figure in the development of systematic thought in psychiatry and psychotherapy. The systematic discussion of the concepts. But Freud himself, as the form, psychotherapy as a form, Freud had limitations, and that's some of his limitations were the fact that he depended a great deal on, if you will, an explanatory and investigative mode that was restricted by something of a very intellectual cast. That position that Freud, especially Freud, maintained an authoritative position vis-a-vis the patients, and that he had a distinctive identification as a biologist and neurologist, and that as much of psychotherapy, his ideas were restricted. The fact that the mind is essentially a subset of the brain. The mind is like the brain, it's something that can be held and shaped and controlled by either the individual or the psychotherapist. Generally, though, through the process, there have been some changes in concepts and approaches to thinking and thinking about the mind per se. When we think of the work of Wittgenstein and the relativism of Heisenberg, distortions of all measures, one person versus another looking at a particular thing. And even the questions of the nature of existence, like Einstein's statements about the fitting facts to external reality, or the statement that if he had worked from basic premises of the time, he would never have discovered the things that he did. So we were moving away from the concept of an external ego acting upon the ego of another, that is shaping external and internal factors and forces and working in psychotherapy in general. That the ego is not simply a set of thoughts and ideas, rather it's much more of an observing and distorting force in perception of interactions. We went on then to an important concept of the intimate connection between mind and language. Dr. Haven brought the important point that in the 20s and 30s in the development of psychoanalysis, one of the important things that was taught, that was learned, was the need for the psychotherapist to shut up. And by the 40s and 50s, we had to begin to learn to talk again. Unfortunately, we didn't know which words to use or how to use them. It was still a problem. Originally, psychiatrists, psychotherapists used basically an interrogative method of asking questions or taking a little piece out of this container or fishbowl. And the change from the interrogative technique to the associative was basically, it did involve a basic change. It did involve moving from attacking that fishbowl and forcibly extracting to allowing things to quote-unquote move out on their own, but still viewed the mind and the brain as an open container from which things could be withdrawn, and still to a very large extent involved the demand of the physician to the imperative to essentially say what comes to mind, which is still something of an authoritative approach. Of course, we discovered the reason for that change was that Freud discovered paradoxically that certain parts of the mind reach out to the therapist and distort the therapist. Even affects the therapist in such a way for the therapist to act in certain patterned ways, of course, as Searles describes, countertransference. Unfortunately, though, we find that the simple techniques of questions or associations are not adequate and needed a different way of talking, a different way of utilizing language in order to get people to make changes. Problems, of course, with the difficulties of language itself, the fact that questions could not penetrate deeply enough, and that the methods of using questions or associations required using orders, which set up, if you will, countercurrents, because of the probing quality of the methods. It essentially demanded one rational container speaking rationally to the rational part of another, and depended a lot on a corresponding view of external reality, in quotes. Perhaps something that needs to be cast out. The basic factors that were brought up were essentially the absence of mind, the fact that our minds, as we sit and listen and sit and interact, are away most of the time. And one of the problems that comes up is losing one's mind, or essentially that it goes away to stay. The difficulty in trying to get the mind to come back. And very little in psychotherapy happens unless you can get that mind back into the room with you. And there are times in which we as therapists have to go out and seek the mind and find out where it is and be there with them. Dr. Haven's statement of, I hope the weather is better in Jamaica, the way of him going with his patient, going with the patient to Jamaica where the patient's ready love was at the time. And essentially it's experienced as the patient as an intrusion of the therapist into his process, to where he is at the time. Now, ultimately, these statements are metaphorical. Most of his thinking, thoughts are metaphors for what we experience. And have to be viewed that way, but still it doesn't necessarily put limitations on the ability of the mind to move and to be in different places. Different places at different times. We're not limited. The mind is not limited by time and space. To move. Now, there were some contentions that I didn't fully understand with that concept. I'll reiterate that.
Thank you, Rick. Let me go on. It's a clear summary. And some of what I start to say now will be a little repetitious of that, but let me do that. That made something helpful too. Now, if the mind isn't simply a container that can be reached into and sampled, nor is it a series of containers, a group of containers with different degrees of accessibility. Not that it doesn't have features of both those, but if that isn't simply what it is, or wholly what it is, what is it? And you recall one of my reasons for occupying your time with this was my contention that the way in which you see the mind will shape, perhaps even determine, the way in which you approach the mind. And so that there's running in parallel through this development the contentions about the mind and then the contentions about the language that one uses in relation to the mind. And as Rick was saying, that if one sees the container as essentially a fishbowl, if you like, into which you can reach with questions, then of course you do that. And of course doctors trained heavily in the ways of the body are likely to think that the mind has that that sort of palpability, that steadfastness, that capacity to be even operated on and remain not too much changed, that are characteristic of the body. Although it's questionable, isn't it, as soon as one makes that comparison, to what extent that is true of the mind. Or, on the other hand, if you see, as Freud did, the mind as a series of containers, then there's one portion of those containers that you can question. A second, that the preconscious, that you can only approach through the method of free association. And then there's a third kind of container which requires the laying out of long stretches of time, the relatively neutral presence of the analyst, in order to attract out of that third container those unconscious complexes which adhere to the person of the analyst in the form of the transference neuroses. That is, in other words, these successive containers each have to be explored by different technical procedures. Well, if there are limitations or even downright falsity to those ideas of mind, how are we to conceive of mind? And I don't mean here mind in every way, of course. I'm speaking of the mind from the viewpoint of the psychotherapist, what the psychotherapist meets. In other words, this is not an account of mind wholly introspective, nor is it an account of mind based on, say, psychological testing, in which one attempts to find out what the strength or brightness of mind might be in certain kinds of procedures. Nor is it the great study of mind which comes about through the studies of the products of mind, that is, literature, science, art, or whatever. This is indeed the study of mind which springs out of the interest of one person in finding and helping another person. Now, as Rick was summarizing, very quickly, Freud came upon two somewhat paradoxical features of mind. One was that it appeared to him to have a certain measure of inaccessibility, and the successive development of hypnosis, head pressing, and method of free association signaled his efforts to come to grips with that aspect of inaccessibility. That is, that appearance and reality were not one and the same thing in mental life, as they are not, of course, in physical life. However, paradoxically, at the same time, he discovered that although mind was seemingly inaccessible to at least some conventional ways of approaching it, mind also had a feature which was, you might say, the opposite of inaccessibility. That is, mind, as Rick was saying, reaches out to the observer, distorts the observer, imagines the observer, sees itself in the observer without knowing it's seeing itself, and even in the more recent work on this subject, especially by Searles, as Rick mentioned, seems to be able to change the observer, to change the analyst, the therapist, along certain patterns that seem related to the patient's experience or drives, or whatever. That paradoxical feature of mind, that is, it's inaccessibility, at the same time it's over-accessibility, it's inaccessibility and over-accessibility, is sometimes disguised because the word unconscious is used in a number of different senses. In the first sense, the unconscious is inaccessible or very difficult to gain access to. In the second sense, the mind is not inaccessible. That is, the patient actually sees his mind in the observer, in the therapist. He distorts the therapist to some extent, and in that distortion is looking at his own mind. However, he is unconscious in another sense, is that he may not be conscious that is his mind that he is looking at. So that apparently the mind is capable of being both present and absent, if you like. It's capable of certain, as we all know, it's capable of a certain degree of insight, outsight, you might, without insight. It can see itself and not realize it is itself. So in some ways the mind resembles a kind of absent-minded author who produces material that he doesn't remember or is his own. Furthermore, this absent-minded author has the extraordinary property of also being an unconscious plagiarist. isn't he, in the sense that the mind is capable of reproducing parts of its experience, seeing them in the external world, and not realizing it has plagiarized that experience from a much earlier time in its life or someone else's life. So this author is, if you can make that comparison, the author is a plagiarist and an absent-minded plagiarist. And I don't think the comparison with an author is altogether inappropriate, in that that's another way in which, as I say, you learn about mind by noting the features of the minds of authors. All of them do those, or can do those particular things. These qualities of absence and presence, however, or inaccessibility, are of course of the most greatest possible interest to us, but they're not, I don't think, the appropriate subjects for our beginning attack on the problems of psychotherapy. It seems to me that, again, as we had umbrated a little bit last time, it seems to me that there are two other aspects of mind with which the psychotherapist confronts still earlier in the process of his work. And as I mentioned, the first of these is the question of presence and absence of mind, as is the patient in the room. And the second question arises from the fact that the mind can be placed at different degrees of distance or closeness to us. And it seems to me these are two matters that are of the utmost, what should we say, beginning importance in the study of psychotherapy. The capacity of mind to be present or absent, and then the capacity of mind to be placed at different distances from us. So those are the features of the psychotherapeutic experience, which I'm calling the experience of mind, which I want to look at first. And to some extent, we approached the first aspect a little bit when I called your attention to this phenomenon of being able to absent your mind, to send it away. And then we compared that with the extreme form of sending your mind away, and losing your mind, which seems to be an accurate account of what happens, in the sense that parts of the mind drop out and vacant feelings are left, and the mind is found at distant places from you. Mind may indeed remain lost, so it isn't a trivial going away. It isn't simply a figure of speech, is it? Because indeed the mind may not be recoverable at all. And then I discussed
You're distinguishing between what the mind is elsewhere as opposed to the mind of the law.
yes, I'm distinguishing the sort of the free discharge of mind, the free movement of mind, what's called imagination, and the losing of mind. And you remember I suggested the hypothesis that perhaps the mind is sometimes lost because the mind is unable to be sent away. That is, that the mind is essentially forced, so to speak, into a kind of state of exile because it doesn't have the freedom to escape from intolerable situations. And I tried to interest you in the idea that certain extreme forms of attention and obedience, which are characteristic of some schizophrenic states, might prepare the way for the need of the mind to essentially break out, shatter, and escape. And if you wanted to test that idea empirically, you might, take a group of people whose minds you thought were without that imaginative freedom and try to train them to a degree of imaginative freedom and see if by that means you prevented them from losing their minds under subsequent circumstances. I've had that experience, although of course these so-called experiments by no means meet the criteria of adequate experimentation. I have a distinct impression that there may be a connection between the capacity for people to learn that imaginative freedom and not and subsequently have to lose their minds. But of course there are so many other things that go on in all those things that one can have no more than the usual kind of clinical impression. However, although these dramatic examples of mind loss and mind absence great clinical interest, to me at least. In everyday clinical life, one meets degrees of absence and distance which are less dramatic. We all know the experience of distraction in ourselves and other people, and we know also that very frequently people can be brought back from states of absence, or people will, if we wait on them, which is very often wise, will return to the room, so to speak, in the course of a patient clinical presence. However, there are circumstances, and I illustrated one with my Jamaica remark, there are circumstances in which the patient's imaginative freedom to move their minds is handled clinically by your imaginative freedom to follow them, so that the imagination to flee is matched by the imagination to pursue, and that the clinical task then becomes not a questioning necessarily or waiting, but searching out, finding, in which one essentially exercises the same psychological power that the patient has exercised in disappearing. That brings us to this, one of the two things I want to talk mostly about this afternoon. And the first is clinical imagination, and then this related issue of clinical distance. Now, by clinical imagination, I mean the clinical knowledge of the various possibilities of biological, dynamic unconscious, and actual human experience. That is, as we gain our education and learning in this field, we stock our minds essentially with the enormous range, particularly of biological possibilities, which modern medicine has given us access to. The essential thing that a physician does, it seems to me, is to know what these possibilities are, and then to know the circumstances under which they emerge, so that even the very most trivial alteration in sensation, pallor, pulse, or whatever, calls to mind to the trained person's, calls to mind the imagination of the trained person various sequences of pathological pathophysiology or whatever in biology. The same thing is true of what we know about the dynamic unconscious, that a certain slip occurs, a complex of ideas or associations or vacancy or something, one kind of calls to mind certain unconscious possibilities of complexes, resistances, etc., that fall under the general topic of clinical analytic theory. I am emphasizing in this discussion of clinical imagination the third range of possibilities, what I call the range of the actual, for two reasons. One, because it's neglected, and the second is it bears a direct relationship to empathy. So let me go at the imagination of the actual. What I mean by the imagination of the actual, you perhaps sense already. That is, those social, experiential events which may have occurred or surrounded the patient's life. A 54-year-old man is admitted to a hospital like this with depression, and the experienced person quickly gets a sense as to the relative likelihoods of this having been associated with a biological change in him, hormonal change, say, or the loss of a job, or the loss of his marriage, or some other sequence of events. And when you have a sense after a while that when an 18-year-old comes in highly disorganized, what kinds of experiences are likely to be associated with this, notably leaving home or going to college. And these are what I mean by the imagination of the actual. On the whole, this is relatively little taught, both because the learning about the biological actual and the unconscious actual occupy so much attention, and also because in psychiatry the study of the actual has been disdained. In France, for example, it has been referred to as the psychiatrie de concierge, essentially back steps psychiatry. And the students of this, like Harry Stack Sullivan, the social psychiatrists, and until relatively recently the family psychiatrists, have now occupied the same prestige as others. However, our awareness of the actual has grown enormously in this half century. Some dramatic aspects of that we're all very conversant with: the discovery of the battered child syndrome, the commonness of incest and rape, which we had not a clear awareness of, et cetera, et cetera. And I like to say that if I were to predict what the most extraordinary events in 20th century psychiatry were, I would say that the first half of this century was marked by the awareness of the nature of mental life in the Freudian sense, of unconscious and semi-conscious mental life, and in the second half of this century, that the most extraordinary event, even to my mind, many would dispute this, of course, even more extraordinary than biological discoveries, has been the discovery of the actualities of family and social life. I don't think it's any accident, for example, that the means by which discoveries of social events occur were begun in individual study before they were applied to the social scene, but with the same purpose. Some of you know, for example, that Sullivan was one of the very first persons to use concealed microphones to record and study interview material in his patients in the 1920s. And I really think there's a direct line between that and something like Watergate, where again the application of technical equipment of an actual kind, which makes it possible for you to reproduce the thing as heard, rather than the fantasy reconstructions of the dynamic unconscious. That both of those begin to teach us a great deal about the nature, on one hand, of the interview and of the interpersonal situation, and on the other hand, the actual functioning of government, or say abscam or something. In any case, the imagination of the actual is in most of us relatively undeveloped, or putting it another way, it for the most part depends upon our own maturation and experience. And the efforts of sociologists, of anthropologists, etc., to infiltrate the medical schools and the psychiatric programs so that we knew something about the Hispanic culture, or we knew something about adolescence, etc. All this has been steadily resisted, although the effort still goes on. And we see in the study, some of the studies of Erickson, George Valiant, Levinson, how there's an effort to come to grips with some of the actualities as well as the dynamic unconscious aspects of the successive phases of life. So that the equipment we have to stock our imaginations of the actual is better than it was, although it still remains a relatively meager part of our experience. I would direct your attention also to the place that existential psychiatry, as well as social psychiatry, plays in this, because of course the interest of existential psychiatry to a large extent is in the unbearable actual, that is, the world as experienced, and its preoccupations of existential psychiatry with death, helplessness, relationshiplessness, etc., are all, again, functions of coming to terms with the actual. It may be, and I believe it myself, that it may well be that the reason that this aspect of our clinical imagination has been less systematically cultivated, let us say, is that it represents an intolerable set of discoveries. That's already implied by what I said about what I thought of the victories of the second half of the 20th century discovery. That essentially, just as the idea that people had perverse thoughts or aggressive thoughts to the extent to which Freud was able to demonstrate, just as that was very difficult for us to accept, so are the realities of human experience. But I think not only is it useful, not only is it wonderful that our clinical imaginations are beginning to be stocked with the actual, but I think it's a sign of the whole culture's taking a less forlorn or defensive attitude toward the actual. Now, the second reason for emphasizing the imagination of the actual, however, springs from a different source, and that is that although, of course, the imagination of the biological processes and unconscious processes are of the greatest importance in our work, they, for the most part, provide us with limited access to the patient. And by that I mean not that they don't help us to understand the patient, they help us enormously understand them, but they do not allow us to approach the patient as patient. That it seems to me, and maybe we can discuss this point at length, it seems to me that the patient has to be met where the patient is, and this involves finding the patient's actual experience in the world. Therefore, and this, of course, placing oneself in the mind of the other, and that is meant the conscious mind of the other. This placing oneself in the conscious mind of the other, which is empathy, therefore depends to a considerable extent on our clinical imagination of the actual. And I think this is evident in sort of everyday experience, that one finds it easier to empathize with those with whom one's own experience is congruent, and that one finds it increasingly easy to empathize with a larger range of people as one's own experience of life increases. But it's obvious that one central task, it seems to me obvious, that one central task of psychiatric education is not to depend so exclusively on these adventitious features of individual experience. So if indeed the imagination of the actual is the ground of empathy, and by extension the means by which the other is found, then we have a fresh and perhaps even more compelling reason to stock our imaginations with the actual possibilities. Now, this brings to my mind anyway, the two principal obstructions to successful empathy, and by extension to the successful finding of the other person. Now, let me speak for a little while on what I think those two principal obstructions are. The first obstruction, it seems to me, is in the patient. That is, it may not be possible for us to empathize with the patient because the patient is not there. Now, I don't mean that the patient is not there in the sense that they may have gone somewhere, because they say it's perfectly possible for us to follow them if we have the wit and the imagination to do so. But the patient may not be there. Or what I mean more explicitly is the patient may not be. The patient may be in a state of what the existentialists call non-existence, and that your effort to find the patient is frustrated by their non-existence. Now, the most obvious form of that, of course, is the person whose mind is lost, or whose mind is so shattered and scattered that the business of being with them confronts only a kind of melee or confusion of mental life that doesn't allow you to find a person or a mind or a self, except in the most fragmentary sense. However, this is again a subject we may want to talk about separately at length, that there may be other conditions of non-existence which don't depend upon the loss of mind.
Coma.
Yeah, right. That's a good one. Or death. I read in the Harvard Medical Alumni Bulletin, typical Victorian professorial remark. What's his name? Somebody, one of those wonderful three names. Professor so-and-so of anatomy, when he first introduced the course to the medical students in anatomy, he would pull back the sheet and with a dramatic rhetorical flourish he would say, "Behold, gentlemen," and no ladies now, "Behold, gentlemen, this corpse was once the seat of a soul. Oh, beware, gentlemen, this corpse was once the seat of a soul." Well, the soul had fled, right? The soul was never to return, as far as we know, except in those cases of resurrection or else which is somewhat disputed. And And coma, as David says, or death, or indeed living death, non-existent. Now, the closest I've been able to come in my clinical experience with non-existence, apart from mind loss, and apart from the temporary absences of distraction and imagination, the closest I've come is a group of cases which I don't know how to name, but which are increasingly obvious to me as I look for them. That is, there are people whose existence is in others, who wait so completely on others' words, gestures, affections, moods, who are not present for themselves, but live in a kind of perpetual empathy with others, in which they don't exist except in what they share, imitate, what are the words to use, of others. Those people, I think, are common. To some degree they're common, but I think even in extreme cases they're not uncommon. But they may be very difficult to recognize because of their empathic capacity. And it may be particularly difficult for us vain physicians and psychologists to recognize them, because if they are successful in what they do, and I think some are very successful in what they do, what they essentially present to us is a mirror of ourselves. And if we enjoy looking in the mirror at ourselves, it becomes extremely easy for us to overlook the absence of them because of our relish of the presence of ourselves. How impressed we are. Now notice that this is the other side of what I talked about when I said that when I spoke about the absent-minded author. That is, here's the absent-minded physician author who doesn't notice that the thing looking at is something that he wrote himself, you might say, that really represents a part of his mind which is present in the clinical situation but not recognized as springing out of him. Now that seems to me a state of non-existence on the patient's part. Not, a partial non-existence, not complete non-existence, because he takes up his existence, of course, in us.
What Winnicott might call a false self.
Might call a false self, right. Just so that the ecology of this terrain is a little clearer, you can quickly see limited forms of existence. For example, people whose existence is solely in their work, or that their existence is solely in a perversion. And one way of looking at perversions is seeing them as a concentration of existence in some particular fetish or whatever.
Doesn't empathy require the ability to resonate to someone else's experience based on your own experience based on them? And if these overly empathic people are overly successful at that, I'm wondering where they got the ability, where they got the experiences that they resonate to in the first place.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. If you think of some of the people that do this in a way that sort of allows a sort of more open observation and study of them, I think you think of people who are great actors, people who are able to take up a part and exist in it in a way that makes that part altogether convincing. Some of those people are said to be without existence when they're off the stage. Laurence Olivier speaks of himself that way, for example. Do you mean?
Peter Sellers wrote
Peter
in the New York
Sellers.
Times, describing himself as having
No self,
personality.
no existence when this thing was not put upon him. No, but where does that capacity come out of such apparent vacancy? There's a wonderful piece that I love. I think some of you have seen it by Alan Sillitoe called Meme, or is it Mimic? I forget. But it's an account of a psychopath written in an autobiographical way. And his answer to your question, and maybe others, but his answer to your question would be I learned, is the way he writes things, I learned to become a cat because in my life I had nothing to do but stare at the cat and watch the cat. And I got so that I could mimic a cat perfectly. And then I got so I could mimic my mother. And sometimes they would throw me out of the house because they would see me in themselves, and they were ridiculous and knew they were ridiculous. And so I would be very badly punished. And read it sometime if you can't find it, I'll find it for you. And you'd enjoy how this person, without a separate existence, I think you might put it, managed to make his life. And what happens when he meets another mimic, and how they mimic each other and mimicking each other. And you have this kind of life of mirrors.
There's a great line in I forget the playwright's name right now, where he says of himself that I understand everyone and everything, and I have no one and nothing.
I'm sure many of you know Keats's famous letter about Shakespeare, which he speculates on how Shakespeare could have imagined all those characters. How he could have brought them all to life. How he could have, he's never outside them looking at them. The whole thing is written for the parts. And how he could have done that and still been a human being. How there could have been anything left of him, because we don't know whether there was. Although he led what looks like a fairly ordinary life in Stratford and even when he retired. But your question of how you get that way, but how do you get any other way when you have that much capacity is another question. Well, I don't know the answer.
Isn't the point often made, though, with this group of people who seem to have that empathic ability, isn't the point often made that it really isn't an empathic ability as much as it is a pseudo-empathic appearance?
Yeah, right. So they might only be sort of, they knew the words were not the music, or they were able to mimic, but they didn't feel. There are various, obviously, all kinds of levels.
Yeah, the very word mimic really implies it.
And yet, if you see a great actor working, the word mimic doesn't do, does it? There's something there that fills it out. But that might be an entree to an understanding of the differences. And I think all of us, for all the wonderfulnesses of us, for all the decency and good sense and strong characters and helpfulness and all the things that make our profession so noble and ourselves so splendid, many of us have come into this work too, partly because we sought to find ourselves. And we do that partly, I think, through our empathic interest in others. I don't mean to make that a pejorative or negative. And yet there are people, clinically, who I, at least, cannot find because of their almost plaster existence against those around them. I like to say they live from mouth to mouth, not from hand to mouth, but from mouth to mouth. They live in the words and the imitation of the mouths of those that speak to them. There are many other types of people that are almost inaccessible, almost non-existent. I think of people, for example, or who appear to be almost. I think of people who are extraordinarily hidden, whom your greatest clinical imagination, your utmost patience, whatever, never make accessible to you, or at least you don't feel that you have ever discovered them. And you have friends, and there are people like that in the history books that have always remained elusive. To others, something escapes. Sometimes the whole person seems to escape. Then there are other people who are so sensitive and unstable that as you approach them, they change. The way some tropical fish, when you pick them up, change color because of a certain kind of sensitivity. So you never find them as they might be in, so to speak, their native habitat. They are so reflective. And then other people are reflective in a different way, like chameleons, that all you can see of them is the background you find them in. They always speak officially, as if they, were speaking for the group or the society or the club or the profession. And they too may be terribly inaccessible. On the other hand, I think we always have to keep in mind that our failure to find someone does not mean they are not there. They may have simply decided that we are not someone to whom they are going to make themselves available. And I know people who it took me a long time to find who had the very best reasons for putting on these various chameleon masks or sensitive masks or hidden masks, but were in fact behind those masks very, very much in existence. So it's too easy to conclude that our methods, that because our methods fail us, that the subject is dead. So that's one source of, major source of empathic failure, the non-existence or meager existence of the subject. There are other sources, of course, of empathic failure, which come from the empathist or the therapist. The therapist, for example, may decide that it isn't a wise idea to empathize. There are many clinical circumstances where the worst thing on earth you can do is to empathize. We know very well, for example, that there are people it is dangerous to empathize with. Many paranoid people, if you get too close to them because of their experience, their tortured experience of intimacy, will become violent if you get too close to them. And then, of course, there are people we know heavily under the name of borderline and other groups too, who take our empathy and it inflames them. They become excited and they regress, as we say, in that merger, and they simply become helpless and fall apart when they have someone in whom they can sort of fall into, if you like, in their experience. So there are circumstances when the last thing on earth you'd want to do clinically is to empathize. And then, of course, there are cases where we cannot empathize, where our experience or our imagination fail us, and we are left not being able to reach out or even find this person when they're relatively seemingly available to other people, perhaps. There's a particular difficulty of empathizing that relates to clinical imagination that I want to spend a moment with. And I don't know, I don't know whether I bored you, as I'm sure I have some of you, with the comparison I like to make between medical education and that passage in Alice in, I don't think I talked about it last time, Alice in Wonderland, where there's description of the White Knight. Do you remember the White Knight? The White Knight was a kind of pathetic Don Quixote figure, and in the Tenniel illustrations, he's rather large, and he's on a very large white horse.
Imagination is so incredibly dense, where your imagination is just packed, and being afraid that someone would tell me something, because I would forget something else. And the patient will say something to you of interest, and that will set in mind a whole range of clinical possibilities, will set your clinical imagination teeming, and then, to your horror, the patient tells you something else, and there just isn't room in your mental processes for those additional things. And so that is a very sharp restriction on our clinical imagination. We know malignant examples of that in people who think everybody is manic, or everybody has an Oedipus complex, or everybody has a death problem. To take a representative folly of each of the major schools, and in which their clinical imagination is, so to speak, clogged or stopped, either because it's so full or because they have particular sectarian prejudices. So that although the clinical imagination gives us partial access to various existences, it at the same time, of course, prevents our access to existence. And that brings to mind the fact that however effective your empathy, it still stands in constant danger of being reflective. That is, in a sense, not a pane of glass, as Carl Rogers says, through which you see the others, but simply a mirror through which you see yourself, or in which you see yourself. I don't know how many of the different slogans or terms for the empathic experience you're conversing with, but the pane of glass is a very famous one that Rogers used to describe the empathic attitude. The therapist must be a pane of glass through which the patient is seen. Another famous one is one that Yalom quotes in his new book from Rollo Mayo. I think it comes from somebody else, and that is the attitude of disciplined naivete. That's the attitude of that. One of my favorites is the one of Martin Buber, the capacity to imagine the real. That's like my concept of clinical imagination, the actual. And there are